She's right, illegal crossings put people's lives at risk, it diverts resources away from those in genuine need, and it's unfair on those who migrate here legally. And that's why one of our 5 pledges to the British people is to stop the boats.
This particular issue came up repeatedly during Prime Minister's questions.
We must absolutely stop the boats and stem the tide of illegal migrants to relieve this pressure on our local communities. I share with him the same desire, which is to stop the boats, stop the boats, stop the boats, stop the boats.
According to the Prime Minister, this issue is even more pressing than the biggest drop in living standards since records began.
The most pressing priority right now is tackling illegal migration. It's stopping people coming here illegally on small boats across the Channel.
But what the Prime Minister doesn't mention is that the huge rise in the numbers of dangerous small boat crossings are a direct consequence of the Brexit deal he championed. A new study by Durham University has found the primary factor in the skyrocketing number of small boat crossings is actually Boris Johnson's oven-ready Brexit deal. According to the report, it was the government's decision to leave the EU without a returns agreement in place, which has led to the huge increase in the number of dangerous crossings. Here are some of the report's key findings. The primary factor behind small boat crossings is the UK's lacking a returns agreement with the EU. The government never assessed the impact of the consequences for leaving the EU without a returns agreement to replace the Dublin regulation and was caught by surprise. The UK did not need to leave this agreement in leaving the EU. Non-EU members have returns agreements with the EU. The lack of a returns agreement fueled an increase in crossings. A key factor is the withdrawal from a returns policy with the EU in 2020. Since 2016, the government has been warned repeatedly about the consequences of leaving the EU without a returns policy in place, including that it would fuel a large increase in irregular migration. It was asked several times to offer an assessment of the consequences, but it declined. The failure to acknowledge its past policy failure has impacted on its ability to fix it. After repeatedly denying the need to make any assessment of its oven-ready deal, the government appears unable to acknowledge that its failure to agree a returns agreement in this deal would have the consequences it has. This is because to address this failing is to recognise its earlier error, which may have political costs. The Home Office has no records of any individuals crossing the Channel in small boats to claim asylum before 2018. Now, this doesn't mean none happened, but it does strongly suggest that any crossings were so few as to go unrecorded. Now take a look at this data from the Durham University report. The number of individuals crossing in small boats has risen sharply from 299 in 2018 to over 45,000 in 2022. And remember, the report concludes, failure to acknowledge its past policy failure has impacted on its ability to fix it. Now we actually have members of the government suggesting the UK needs to join Russia and Belarus as the only European countries outside the Human Rights Convention to fix this problem.
We do need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights.
It's absolutely ludicrous. And remember this, the European Convention on Human Rights protects the right to a fair trial, freedom of assembly and expression, the right to participate in free elections, freedom of religion, freedom from discrimination, the right to privacy, freedom from torture and degrading treatment.
Mr. Speaker, the best way to ensure that children grow up not in poverty is to make sure they grow up in a workless household.
He just doesn't get it. Paltry wages and a cost of living crisis means the UK's poorest families are getting even poorer. More than 4 million children are living in poverty under this government. More than 4 million. That's a staggering 30% of children, and 75% of children growing up in poverty actually live in a family where at least one person is working. Just think about that.
Hundreds of thousands fewer children in poverty.
Where has this guy been? Child poverty has hit a record high in the UK, and more than 14 million people now live in poverty. That's 1 in 5, and more are being pushed into poverty every single day. It's not surprising given successive Conservative governments have overseen a decade of soaring food banks, poverty, homelessness and wage stagnation. 2 million adults in this country can't even afford to eat every day. In the fifth largest economy in the world, these are shocking statistics and a damning indictment of the record of this government.
What I would urge him and his colleagues to do is be on the side of working people, and that's to back our laws, to introduce minimum safety levels across the NHS and transport.
While leaving on a shelf, the Prime Minister is deliberately trying to cause confusion by conflating minimum safety levels with minimum service levels. His anti-strikes bill will actually rob millions of UK workers of their democratic right to withdraw their labour, force them to work against their will and allow them to be sacked if they refuse. It's unthinkable, unworkable and almost certainly illegal. And since when was robbing workers of their fundamental democratic right to strike being on the side of working people? Never underestimate just how thick this government thinks we all are.